Everyone knows how World War II ended. We've seen the footage, read the numbers, memorized the winners and losers. But almost no one knows how it actually began. Not the way it's taught, not the way it's remembered. What if the first shot wasn't fired, but staged? August 31st, 1939. The world stood on the edge, and just before it fell, something strange happened in a small border town called Gleiwitz. A German radio station was attacked. Screams, gunshots. Polish voices broadcast over the airwaves. It sounded like war had arrived, but it hadn't. The attackers weren't Polish. They were Germans, SS officers in stolen uniforms, reading a script written weeks in advance. They dragged in a prisoner, dressed him as a saboteur, shot him in cold blood, and left the body as proof. It wasn't a battle. It was theater. And it worked. The next morning, Hitler told the world that Poland had invaded, that German blood had been spilled. That war was the only answer, and just like that, Europe was engulfed in flames. You weren't taught this in school. You were told that Germany was provoked, that Poland was reckless, that war was inevitable. But what if it wasn't? What if the most devastating war in human history began with a performance? What if the first truth we believed about World War II was already a lie? This isn't just about one fake attack. It's about how narratives are crafted, how fear is engineered, how history is manipulated not just by victors, but by storytellers in uniform. And once you see the blueprint, you'll never look at history or modern headlines the same way again. The Gleiwitz incident wasn't a spark. It was a match lit in secret and thrown on purpose. It didn't happen in Berlin. It didn't happen in Warsaw. It happened in a forgotten radio station near the German-Polish border, Gleiwitz, a quiet place, until the night it was used to ignite a global catastrophe. On August 31st, 1939, just before midnight, a group of German operatives dressed in Polish military uniforms stormed the radio station. They fired shots. They forced German announcers to speak scripted lines in broken Polish. Then they transmitted a short, chaotic broadcast calling for Polish aggression against Germany. Moments later, they left behind a corpse dressed as a Polish saboteur. The body, codenamed Conserve, had been drugged, murdered, and dumped for the press. It was the perfect crime, the perfect lie, and no one questioned it. This wasn't an isolated move. It was part of a broader deception campaign called Operation Himmler, a series of coordinated false flag operations orchestrated by the Nazi regime to fabricate a narrative of Polish hostility. Burned border checkpoints, faked skirmishes, dozens of staged provocations along the frontier, all choreographed to justify what was already decided: invasion. Behind the scenes, the order came from the top. Hitler himself approved the plan. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the SS, supervised the execution. And Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, ensured that all traces would disappear. It wasn't war. It was a cinematic production with real blood and real consequences. The timing was surgical. Within hours of the incident, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, claiming that Germany had been attacked. His words were cold, rehearsed. This night, for the first time, Polish regular soldiers fired on our territory. The truth? Not a single Polish soldier had crossed the border before that speech. But the lie had momentum now, and no one wanted to stop it. Western intelligence had doubts. British and French agents intercepted whispers, inconsistencies in German radio traffic, reports from local informants that didn't add up. Some suspected the incident had been staged, but no one acted. Silence became complicity. The world was on edge. Any spark could have triggered a war, and Hitler knew that if he provided the spark, even a fake one, the rest would follow. It's easy to look back and see a dictator manipulating his way into war, but the deeper truth is far more disturbing. This wasn't just one man. It was an entire apparatus, military, political, media, moving in lockstep to manufacture consent. The plan worked, not because it was brilliant, but because it fed into existing fears, existing tensions, existing prejudices. It confirmed what people already wanted to believe. That's the nature of a successful lie. It doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be timely. And once the world accepted that Poland struck first, the floodgates opened. On September 1st, German troops invaded Poland with full force. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Within weeks, Europe was burning. All of it set into motion by a staged event, carried out in the dead of night, in a place most people had never heard of. The Gleiwitz incident didn't just mark the beginning of a military conflict. It marked the birth of a psychological weapon, one that would be refined, rebranded, and reused for decades to come. Because if a war can be started with a lie, a small, controlled lie, then the entire world becomes a stage, and the truth, just a prop. There are no commemorations for Gleiwitz, no monuments, no curriculum teaches children about the dead prisoner dumped like evidence on a soundstage. His name was never meant to be remembered, just like the lie he died for. But buried in the silence is a lesson too dangerous to ignore. Wars don't always begin with bombs. Sometimes they begin with microphones. By the time the sun rose on September 1st, 1939, the lie had already been printed, broadcast, and consumed. The attack on Gleiwitz, though fabricated, was now official history. The Nazi media machine moved with surgical precision, transforming a staged incident into a righteous cause. German newspapers ran headlines with chilling certainty. Polish bandits strike German soil. Germany forced to defend itself. These weren't mere reports, they were weapons, crafted narratives meant to ignite emotion, mobilize hatred, and erase doubt. Within hours of the Gleiwitz event, Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels had every major outlet echoing the same line. It wasn't just news, it was orchestration. Radio stations repeated the message. Images of fake Polish saboteurs were published. The public, unaware of the fabrication, responded as expected, with anger, fear, and support for retaliation. Goebbels understood the formula. He didn't need facts, he needed rhythm, repetition, familiar enemies, emotional triggers. By the time the German people heard Hitler speak that same morning, they weren't questioning, they were nodding, because the groundwork had been laid before the first shot was ever fired, and Hitler delivered. In his address to the Reichstag, he declared, "Since 5:45 a.m., we've been returning fire." A statement designed to sound defensive, not aggressive. But there was a quiet brilliance behind that lie. It gave the illusion of restraint, as if Germany had been holding back until it couldn't anymore. That speech, broadcast to millions, carried a truth no one questioned. Not because it made sense, but because it came with authority, urgency, and volume. Poland denied the accusations, frantically, publicly, but their voice was drowned beneath the orchestrated outrage. The damage was done. It wasn't just about telling a story, it was about telling it fast enough, loud enough, and often enough that no one had time to question. By the time the truth surfaced, years later in courtrooms and archives, it was irrelevant. The world had already moved on. This is the anatomy of narrative warfare. A real-time rewriting of reality, backed by microphones, printing presses, and uniforms. And in 1939, no one did it better than Nazi Germany. But this tactic didn't end with them. What Goebbels perfected has become a template, not just for totalitarian regimes, but for modern governments, corporations, and media conglomerates. The language has changed, the platforms have evolved, but the strategy remains. Manufacture a threat, frame the enemy, control the story, deliver it before the facts can catch up. This is why Gleiwitz matters. Not because of the scale of the operation, it was small, almost laughably theatrical, but because of its effectiveness. A war was launched, a population was convinced, and all it took was a script, a corpse, and a microphone. Today, we like to believe we're more informed. That with the internet, with access, with skepticism, we're immune. But the truth is, we're just faster at consuming, not necessarily better at questioning. And the machine, it's faster too, more subtle, more sophisticated. Back then, it took a night to fabricate a war. Today, it might only take a tweet. In 1939, the lie was dressed in a uniform and broadcast through state radio. Now it wears a suit, sits on a news desk, or appears in a headline that vanishes hours later. The tools have changed. The objective hasn't. The media didn't just report the beginning of World War II. It helped write the script. And the audience, then as now, never knew they were watching a performance. It took years, decades even, before the truth about Gleiwitz was confirmed. Not by rumors or survivors, but by files, testimonies and transcripts buried deep inside the machinery of post-war justice. The Nuremberg trials, launched in the aftermath of the Third Reich, became the first place where the curtain was pulled back. But even then, only a fragment of the performance was exposed. Under oath, high-ranking Nazi officers confessed. They described the planning, the execution, the orders. The operation's code name, Himmler's idea, was finally spoken aloud in court. Operation Himmler. It wasn't just one false flag event. It was a network of them, a multi-pronged deception strategy designed to manufacture war with precision. SS officer Alfred Naujoks admitted his role in Gleiwitz. He detailed how the body was prepared, how the Polish-language broadcast was scripted, how the uniforms were stitched to mimic the enemy, and most chillingly, how none of it was questioned by those in charge. "We were told it was for the greater good," he said, a phrase that would echo again and again from those seated in the dock. The tribunal documented everything, the photos, the orders, the confessions. Yet when the verdicts were handed down, something strange happened. The Gleiwitz incident was not given the weight one might expect for a deception that launched a world war. It became a footnote in a larger storm, a paragraph in a 1,000-page report, conveniently minimized in the face of greater horrors: Auschwitz, Stalingrad, Hiroshima. But why? Because by the late 1940s, the world had changed. The Allies, now victors, were looking ahead. A new threat had emerged: the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun before the Old War was fully buried, and in this new geopolitical chessboard, revisiting how World War II actually started was inconvenient. Gleiwitz raised questions that no one wanted answered. Questions about media complicity, intelligence failures, Western silence. If Germany could fabricate a war, what did that say about the systems meant to stop it? What did it say about the vulnerability of democracy itself? So the files remained where they were safest, in the archives, not erased, but buried, cited in academic texts, whispered about in intelligence circles, but never allowed to enter the mainstream consciousness, until fragments began to leak. Declassified documents from British intelligence confirmed their suspicions at the time. Communications from MI6 agents referenced curious discrepancies in the Polish attack narrative. One memo, dated September 3, 1939, stated, "Our sources indicate the incident may have been contrived." It ended with a chilling line: "No further action advised." In the United States, captured German documents analyzed by the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, revealed even more. Internal Nazi communication spoke openly about Operation Himmler, but the OSS never published its findings. The reason? Focus had shifted to Soviet espionage. The past, no matter how fraudulent, was now less urgent than the future. This silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. And so the official story remained. Poland attacked, Germany retaliated, a tragic escalation, but understandable. The truth stayed locked away, not because it was too dangerous, but because it was too useful to ignore. And then came the pattern. As conflicts erupted throughout the 20th century, echoes of Gleiwitz reappeared. In Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, another questionable attack that led to war. In Iraq, weapons of mass destruction that never existed but justified an invasion. Different governments, different motives, same blueprint: create the threat, sell the outrage, deliver the war. Once you understand Gleiwitz, you begin to recognize the ritual. It starts with a broadcast, a headline, a grainy video. Then come the accusations, the urgency, the flags, the speeches, the justification. And finally, the silence, the moment when facts surface too late, long after the blood has been spilled and the lies have ossified into memory. The documents exist, the confessions are real, the files were unsealed, but none of it seemed to matter, because the story people were told felt better. It was cleaner, more heroic, easier to digest. Evil invaded, good resisted. The war began because it had to. That story still lives in textbooks, documentaries, and presidential speeches. But beneath it lies another story, one made of shadows, whispers, and files stamped classified. A story that reveals how fragile the truth becomes when power decides what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. The Gleiwitz incident wasn't just the ignition of World War II. It was a prototype. And once that prototype worked, it was never shelved, only refined. Wars are not launched with logic. They are launched with emotion. Beneath every declaration, every mobilization, every explosion, there is a deeper weapon at play: fear. Gleiwitz was not just a tactical deception, it was psychological conditioning. It showed, in real time, how a population could be pulled into agreement without fully understanding the game being played. Manufactured consent is not about truth, it's about tempo. It's about flooding the mind before it can question, framing events so tightly that doubt becomes treason. In Nazi Germany, the people didn't beg for war. They accepted it as a tragic necessity because they were made to feel attacked, humiliated, cornered. Gleiwitz was the match, but the tinder was years of propaganda, humiliation after Versailles, orchestrated resentment, and racialized paranoia. The false flag only needed to confirm what the nation had already been primed to believe, that Germany was a victim once again. This is the trap. When a government convinces its people that survival is at stake, morality is suspended. Questions become dangerous, opposition becomes betrayal, and ordinary citizens become instruments of extraordinary violence. The mechanism is subtle. You don't need to erase facts, you only need to frame them. You don't need to silence every voice, just the ones that speak too early. Most people will silence themselves, out of fear, out of fatigue, out of loyalty to a flag they never chose but were born under. In 1939, the German public didn't see Gleiwitz for what it was, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were overwhelmed by certainty. The images, the headlines, the speeches, they worked in concert to replace doubt with narrative. And once the emotional lever was pulled, once fear and duty and anger fused into one, they followed. This isn't unique to Nazi Germany. The same psychology operates in every society. Different uniforms, different accents, same architecture. After 9/11, Americans were told they were under attack from enemies abroad, shadowy, undefined, omnipresent. The response was immediate: war, surveillance, patriot acts. Few questioned the rapid erosion of civil liberties because the framing was absolute. You're either with us or you're with them. The technique is always the same. First, create urgency. Then, simplify the enemy. Remove complexity. Reduce centuries of tension into a single act of aggression. Finally, repeat. Not because the facts need reinforcement, but because repetition builds reality. The human brain wasn't built for constant doubt. In a crisis, we seek clarity, even if it's false, especially if it's false. Gleiwitz worked not because it was brilliant, but because it aligned with a deeper psychological design, the need to belong, to believe, to defend. A false attack became real in the minds of millions, and that belief became war. Even now, nations repeat the formula. A terrorist threat, a chemical attack, an incursion, always just enough fear to override logic. Always just enough outrage to create obedience. Consent doesn't have to be enthusiastic. It only needs to be passive. Most wars don't need cheering crowds. They need silence. That silence, the kind that follows a broadcast, the kind that settles after the first airstrike, is where the real battle happens. It's not between armies. It's between awareness and amnesia. And once amnesia wins, anything is possible. Gleiwitz taught a generation how easy it is to turn civilians into soldiers, voters into weapons, and truth into a matter of timing. It wasn't just a trick, it was a template. And the most disturbing part? It still works. There's a reason you've never heard of Gleiwitz in school, a reason your textbooks skipped it, your teachers never mentioned it, and your documentaries quietly passed it by, because it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't cooperate with the myth. The official story of World War II is simple. Evil rose, the world resisted, and good prevailed. It's a story of clear lines, moral certainty, and righteous force. But Gleiwitz muddies those waters. It suggests that the war didn't begin with aggression, but with deception. Not with an attack, but with a performance. And that makes everything harder to explain, because if the beginning was staged, then what else was? This is the discomfort no one wants to face. Not politicians, not educators, not the media, because the moment you admit that a war of this scale, one that killed over 70 million people, was ignited by a lie, you unravel the entire moral architecture of the 20th century. The truth doesn't erase the crimes that followed. It doesn't excuse them. But it does change how we understand them. It forces us to confront not just the cruelty of one regime, but the fragility of our institutions, how easily they can be manipulated, how quickly the truth can be overrun by intention. The absence of Gleiwitz in our collective memory is not accidental. It was edited out, gradually, intentionally, under the logic of national pride, educational simplicity, and geopolitical necessity. Because to teach that the world's most devastating war began with a lie is to admit how little control we truly have over history. Schools prefer heroes and villains, not scripts and stages. They teach that Germany invaded Poland unprovoked. That war was the only response, that the Allies were reluctant but righteous. But the documents say otherwise. The files exist, the testimonies were recorded. The blood spilled in that radio station was real, and yet silence. Why? Because Gleiwitz dismantles the binary. It tears down the idea that wars happen because of bad men and good resistance. It reveals a deeper, more disturbing truth, that wars happen when lies are believable, when the public is emotionally cornered, when media becomes a weapon and dissent becomes heresy. Gleiwitz is not just a hidden event. It's a litmus test. If the world could be dragged into war by a radio broadcast and a dead body in disguise, then how many other stories we've accepted, wars, revolutions, interventions, were born from the same shadows? What textbooks refuse to explore is what your instincts already suspect. That power writes history, that silence is strategic, and that the events most threatening to the official story are often the ones least discussed. You were told that World War II was the good war, that it was necessary, that it was just, and maybe in the grand sweep of history it was. But its origin, the first breath, the spark that set it all in motion, was a fabrication, a violent fiction written by men who understood the power of illusion. And they didn't just get away with it. They were rewarded with obedience, with loyalty, with blind faith. The war machine was oiled by belief, by students who never questioned, by soldiers who never knew. by citizens who thought they were defending truth when they were defending a narrative. That's why it's not taught, because once you see the lie at the beginning, you start looking for it everywhere else. So the war that defined the 20th century didn't begin with a battlefield. It began with a broadcast, a body, a costume, a script. It began in a quiet room where orders were whispered and documents were signed. It began with a camera angle no one questioned and a headline that traveled faster than doubt. Gleiwitz was never about Poland. It was about perception. It was about how easily a world already on edge could be pushed with the gentlest of lies. Not with tanks, not with bombs, but with suggestion, framed aggression, manufactured urgency. And it worked. The lie didn't just start a war. It became a model, a ritual repeated in new forms, new conflicts, new eras, always justified, always urgent, always too late to reverse. We like to think we would have seen it, that we would have asked questions, but history suggests otherwise. History shows that when fear is high and truth is quiet, people choose sides before they check facts. Gleiwitz wasn't an exception. It was a demonstration, a revelation of how fragile reality becomes when it's delivered by authority. And now you know. You know that the first shot of World War II wasn't fired, it was staged. You know that history, like any performance, depends on who holds the script. And the only question that remains is how many other scripts have already been written? How many truths do we live inside that were never true at all? If this made you question what you thought you knew, imagine what's coming next.